So we are talking about the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. We're talking about the section of the writings that particularly deal with being wise. And you'll remember from last week, we discussed the Hebrew concept of wisdom, that it's not something that is necessarily pertaining to extreme intelligence. It's not something that's ethereal or esoteric and difficult to grab a hold of. But when the Bible talks about being wise, it talks about particularly the ability to live skillfully or to understand the proper path to take in a given situation, in given circumstances, and then the ability to follow that plan. So there is a wisdom, a smarts and intelligence factor to wisdom, but it also has to do with discipline and just being able to follow through on the proper course of action. We saw that in the book of Job, in the call to understand the sovereignty and the control of God, even when God's people are in trial. And the wise man, the godly man, according to the book of Job, says, I understand when I suffer that God is still in control, and I will entrust myself to Him. I will trust Him and trust in His control over my circumstances. Proverbs, proverbially, in pithy sayings, sums up wisdom in all walks of life, but it is primarily taken with workday life, what happens on a regular basis from day to day. And now that brings us to the Song of Solomon. So as we consider the Song of Solomon, we consider more of the writings of the wisest man ever to walk the earth, the wisest man of his day, and that is King Solomon. And as we consider then the title of the book, the title is, of course, the Song of Songs in Hebrew. And this is interesting because in Hebrew, this is how you do the superlative. So in English, we say that something is superlative by using the ending est. So if we say that something is the highest of good, it's the best, the goodest. No, we don't say goodest. But if something is the I don't know, give me an example of an EST word, guys. I blank after best. Mostest. Yeah, something like that. But if you hear EST, that means it's the supreme example of that. It is the superlative example. In Hebrew, you did it like this. It's the blank of blanks. So it's the Tom of Toms, and you have the Thomist. Or the Matt of Matts, and you have the greatest of the Matts. Or we know the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords on a more serious note. Jesus Christ is the highest of the kings. He is the greatest of the lords. And so when we have the Song of Songs in Hebrew, it's the songist. It's the song out of Solomon's thousands of songs, or 1,000 songs. So this is the top of the line. This is top notch when it comes to Solomon's writings in song. The Vulgate reflects that, the Canticum Canticorum, the Song of Songs. And in English, we often call it the Song of Solomon, which can mean, and probably does mean, that it's by Solomon. It also could mean for Solomon or in the style of Solomon, but I would understand this probably to have been written by Solomon. The date, it would have been written sometime between 970 and 931 BC, because that's when Solomon lived. Yep, very good. All right. That's when Solomon's the king, and we'll have the king referred to in the book of the Song of Solomon. Take a look at your syllabus and you can see its position. Sometimes in some of the Old Testament texts, and some of the Hebrew texts, in the Masoretic text, for example, it's between Ruth and Ecclesiastes, and as it's related to the Jewish holy days, it would have been associated with the first of the feasts. Each of these, Ruth, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther, were associated with a different feast in the Hebrew calendar. So that changes things around there a little bit. Now, as far as major themes, Song of Solomon celebrates marital love, and so imagine that. My love is one of the major themes of Song of Solomon. My love, my companion, my bride, my sister. That sounds a little weird to us, but not so much to them. Solomon calls his love, his bride, the most beautiful among women, and my beloved. The terms that they use for one another are major themes. The daughters of Jerusalem happen as well. Now, there is some structure here that looks a little bit like a play. And the daughters of Jerusalem, were this a play, would serve as the chorus. They explain to us. They're like the chorus that comes in a play and they sing about what's going on. They tell us what's happening. And they move did you like this? This was the chorus dancing in, for those of you who didn't catch that. They serve to set the scene for us. So when the chorus speaks, when the chorus sings, pay attention, because they're going to help us understand what's happening. The king, Solomon, is also a major theme. He's a major character. So King Solomon, as you might expect in the Song of Solomon, Solomon is a major character. He is called the king. He is called Solomon a couple of different times, a number of different times. We also see a shepherd. He is referred to as a guardian. There is a garden. The garden here is, let's say, euphemistic. I'll let you guys figure out what the reference is there to. But also, hang on to your hats, guys. Wine is also a major theme in the Song of Solomon. These in particular point us to what this is all about. It is a celebration of the marital relationship and the enjoyment and the pleasure that is to be experienced and enjoyed between a husband and a wife. There is a build-up in this where there's a time during the courtship before they're married where you have the characters implore not to wake up my love before she pleases. We'll see here that the climax, the center of the chiasm that makes up the book is the marriage night, and wine stands for the enjoyment and the pleasure that the two are to have together. The purpose of the book of Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs, marital joy, the marital joy experienced by the man and the woman is celebrated. Popular to contrary belief, the Song of Solomon is not about Christ and the church. It is about a man and a woman and the marriage relationship and the enjoyment that God intends for that relationship to carry. Take a look at the structure, and we'll work our way through this a little bit. Excuse me, in your charts, and this is unfortunately broken up over 2 pages, But you'll note again that we have a chiastic structure. And where is our attention to be drawn in a chiasm? Guys, do you remember? We talked about this before. Right to the middle, right? Okay, very good. It is pulled to the middle of the chiasm. And if you'll look, the center of the chiasm here is L and L prime. They end up in the garden on the wedding night. The first half of the book, chapters 1, 2, 3, and the beginning of chapter 4, it seems that this is the courtship, that they are moving toward marriage and expressing their desire for one another. They're looking forward to the time when they come into the marriage bond. And then at the very center of the book, you have the consummation of the marriage when the garden is unlocked and he is able to come in and they enjoy the time there together. And then the second half of the book has to do with the marriage relationship and even sometimes the difficulties that come along in that and the reuniting that happens even in marital difficulty, or that ought to happen even in marital difficulty. And you can see that there are parallels back and forth there all the way through the book that seem to point us to the center of the book there. So that is the Song of Solomon, a beautiful work that celebrates the wonder of the marital relationship. So, yay. It's a good thing. It's a very good thing.
Before I came to Indian Hills,
Uh-huh.
5.5 years ago, I don't think I'd ever heard it taught as taken literally.
As a celebration of the marriage relationship.
Not that I'd heard much about it in general at all.
Yeah, it doesn't get preached a lot, especially not in like junior high, high school, for various reasons. But
But I just assumed, from the little I heard, I just thought it was Christ, an analogy for Christ in the church.
yeah, there's no reason to understand this as something other than a celebration of the relationship between a man and his wife, and the anticipation as it builds and the enjoyment as it arrives, and life as it comes. So that moves us to the last of the wisdom literature, and that is the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes. And this is another one that sometimes people have a hard time with, just understanding what in the world is going on here. We'll talk about that as we go forward, and what I think is going on, and what I think is the best way to approach the book of Ecclesiastes. By way of introduction here, we have the title. In Hebrew, the title is Kohelet. That is the Hebrew word that means to convene an assembly, or a preacher. And for those of you guys who have taken Greek with me, you'll recognize the foundations of this word, Ecclesiastes. The church is the ecclesia, and you see where that would come. Now, if you're like me, you're thinking, wait, there's no church in the Old Testament. What in the world? He calls himself the preacher, though. You'll note the beginning of the book says the words of the preacher. And so that's where the idea comes from. Someone who is speaking to or teaching or preaching to a convened assembly. Hence our title, the Ecclesiastes. The words of the preacher. The date here Again, we put it sometime during Solomon's reign, 970 to 931 BC, because Solomon seems to have wrote it. I would guess, my understanding, my interpretation would be that this is probably late in Solomon's life. In fact, I could very well see a scenario where Solomon is coming toward the very end of his life, and he looks back on it, sees a good bit of his foolishness that to go along with his great wisdom, and offers his evaluation of his life and offers wisdom in light of what happened with his life at the end of his life. So I would guess you're probably much closer to 931 than you are to 970 with the book of Ecclesiastes. Some of the major themes, and this is what a lot of people think of, this is what we often think of when we think of Ecclesiastes, this idea of vanity or vapor. In fact, that's how the book starts off. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity and striving after the wind. Now, the idea of this word vanity, this word vapor, it's like, you probably heard this illustration before. It's like if you have a cup of coffee or a cup of hot chocolate in the morning, and the mist that rises off of it, the steam that comes off the cup of coffee, you don't get this far off the coffee, off the warm beverage, before the mist is gone. And that's the idea, or like the mist rising off a lake or something like that. This idea of vanity, of vapor, of striving after wind. Solomon says these things are of no advantage, no profit. If something is vain, there's no real long-term advantage to it. There's no long-term profit to it. If you were able to run to the lake that the mist is coming off of and grab some of that mist in your hand, and you opened your hand, what would you have? Nothing, right? And that's the idea of vanity. Things that are vain, things that are a vapor. There's no profit to them. There's no advantage. I have no profit there's no profit to having run to that. I think that's how I was trying to say it. There's no profit of having run to the lake and grabbed up a handful of that stuff and then I got nothing. A lot of people tell me I got nothing for a lot of different reasons, but I would have nothing in my hand. And so that's Solomon's evaluation of things, particularly as it pertains to that which is under the sun. Okay, when Solomon talks about the things that are under the sun, he's talking about things from an earthly perspective, the things that go on here on earth. The things that are lived with no perspective beyond the sun. How about that? So Solomon says, if you are living life with no thoughts of what goes beyond this earth, then when you really come down to the nuts and the bolts of the things, there's no advantage anywhere in any of it. I mean, he says, what do you gain? And here's the equalizer that makes all of that not really of any profit. It's death. It's the end of the day. Or as Solomon might put it, it's when the score will be tallied. Solomon's going to talk about living life under the sun with no perspective that goes beyond this world. He says, if you really sit and think about it, at the end of the day, when you die, it's all vanity. Who really comes out ahead? Remember that old, remember those No Fear shirts? You guys are probably too young. Tom probably remembers them. All right, I hit the sweet spot with one of you guys in the room. Not a good batting average. There was a shirt that I used to have, a t-shirt on the back of it. It said, he who dies with the most toys still dies, right? This is the conclusion of Ecclesiastes. The one who has the most stuff, the one who's accomplished the most things, the one who has the most power, the most fame, the most glory, the most money, the most whatever have you, the one who's had the most pleasure in this life, at the end of the day, if this life is lived under the sun, death is the great equalizer. As far as this earth is concerned, Steve Jobs doesn't have anything more than, I don't know, some poor guy who died on the street last week. Right? When you really think about it, what's the advantage to Steve Jobs at this point? There isn't one. He's dead. He had all the money in the world. He had the most successful company on the entire earth, and now it's nothing for him. And Solomon says, when you come to the end of the day, all your labor, all your toil, all your work, all these other things, as far as it goes under the sun, there's no advantage to them. However, when Solomon thought about things in this light, in this way, he said, you know what? I considered all this and I wanted to die. There wasn't any advantage to any of these things as long as I thought about things underneath the sun. But if I lived life under the fear of the Lord, it meant that I could enjoy life. I love the message of Ecclesiastes is this. Apart from God, there is nothing in this life that can bring lasting satisfaction. There's nothing in this life that can bring advantage. I'm giving this all away. There's nothing in life that can bring anything that's worth anything beyond a handful of vapor. But when you fear God, you can enjoy life and the things that you receive, the things that you earn, the toil and the labor of your life and the things that those gain. You can enjoy the wife of your youth because you understand that those things are a gift from God, that they come from Him. And so the conclusion is going to be what? Fear God and keep His commandments. The admonition at the end of the book is remember your Creator in the days of your youth when your body still works and you can do things that are fun. Because then you can truly enjoy the things that God gives your hand to do and to enjoy and to experience. So Solomon's admonition, the whole movement of the book of Ecclesiastes is this. Fear God, keep His commandments, serve Him, and enjoy what the Lord brings. Because it is a gift from His hand to enjoy. The heart and the sons of men also come into this. The heart, the son of man, the sons of man, mankind. These things are made to love and to serve the Lord. The purpose of the book says that in spite of the seeming futility involved in man's existence, the wise man should fear God and enjoy his life as a gift from the Lord. Take a look at your chart on Ecclesiastes here and we can see another chiastic structure here. And it opens with a poem about the brevity and the seeming insignificance of life. Vanity of vanities, all is vanities. What advantage does a man have in all his work? And in the first 2 chapters, the book is fascinating to me. And there is an amazing, not only instructional message to this book, but to me there's also an amazing evangelistic message to this book. You look around at people who live their life for wealth, power, enjoyment, but find no fulfillment in these things because these things don't inherently bring that. What does it take to enjoy what the Lord has provided? Well, it takes recognizing that these things are a gift from God. But Solomon sets out in the first 2 chapters to lay things out. He says, look here. And remember, this is Solomon, who was the wisest and smartest man who had ever lived. He was among the wealthiest men who had ever lived. There was nothing that a lack of wealth would prevent him from doing. You know, he would never have to sit down with his budget sheet and say, you know what, I can't afford to try that this month. I don't have the money to do it. He had the intelligence to do whatever he set his mind to, in essence. If Solomon decided he wanted to do something, he could do it. He had the manpower and the resources to be able to do anything he wanted. He had the platform from which to gain the respect of the entire world, which he did. So he had the ability to build a legacy. He had the ability to do whatever he wanted. He had access to anything that the world had to offer. And he said, I set out to do an experiment. I wanted to know what would bring fulfillment. I wanted to know what would bring fullness. I wanted to know what would bring more than just this vapor that you hold in your hand. Chapter 1, verse 12, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. It is a grievous task which God has given the sons of men to be afflicted with. And I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun. Behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. He starts out and he says, look, I've done it all. I've experienced it all. I've tried it all. I've achieved it all. And all of those things for their own sake, they're vanity. When you come to the end of the day, they're not worth anything. He says in chapter 2, verse 20, therefore I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun. When there is a man who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, when he gives his legacy to one who has not labored with them, he too is vanity and a great evil. Or this too is a vanity and a great evil. For what does a man get in all his labor and in his striving with which he labors under the sun? Because all his days his task is painful and grievous. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is vanity. He says, look, there's no advantage at the end of the day to having achieved and possessed and owned all of these things. But then, at a number of different junctures, he adds in these little shots of true wisdom. He says, there's nothing better in verse 24 for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen, and here's why he can enjoy. The wise man can enjoy his labor and the fruits of his labor. I have seen that this is from the hand of God. So do you see that the plane has changed there, and we have several times this bounce back and forth. But Solomon says, look, if I understand that these things are a gift from the Lord, then there's enjoyment here, there's pleasure here, and that's the best that a man can do. He says, for who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? For a person who is good in his sight, to a person who is good in his sight, he has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner he has given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to one who is good in God's sight. This too is vanity and striving after the wind. That's a summation of the book, really. Solomon then has another poem about time. Lays out the problem. The world is full of injustice. Lays out another problem in chapter 4. The world is full of dissatisfied people who are seeking wealth. But we come to the center of the book, the center of the chiasm in chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. Look at this. Guard your steps as you go to the house of God and draw near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. Do not be hasty in word or impulsive in thought to bring up a matter in the presence of God, for God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For the dream comes through much effort, and the voice of a fool through many words. When you make a vow to God, do not be late in paying it, for he takes no delight in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow any than you should vow and not pay. Do not let your speech cause you to sin. Do not say in the presence of the messenger of God that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry on account of your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For in many dreams and in many words there is emptiness. Rather, fear God. That's the center of the book. That is the conceptual center of the book. The middle of the chiasm there. Everything rotates around that call to fear God. We come out in the second half of chapter 5, then another problem, the same problem as he observed before. The world is full of dissatisfied people seeking wealth. Chapter 5, the end of the chapter, the problem again is presented. The world is full of misfortune and deprivation. E prime, just like E, the problem is presented that the world is full of injustice and unfairness. D prime, again, another poem about time that mirrors the poem in chapter 3. C prime here, the wisdom's guidance despite its shortcomings. Wisdom concerning the brevity of life in chapters 11 and 12. Practical advice about living life in the conclusion. The author is mentioned again in the third person, but you see here the conclusion. When all is said and done in this, fear God and keep his commandments. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. So you have there the book of Ecclesiastes. Wisdom laid out that says there is not a whole lot that is satisfying about this world, about this life, apart from understanding the things that are accomplished, the things that are given, the things that are experienced in life are a gift from the Lord. Any questions about Ecclesiastes? All right, Steve.
No, I'm just going to say, yeah, Steve Jobs, he couldn't enjoy, life because he didn't fear God, but we got the benefits of his labor.
We did. And you see some of that. You see Solomon says, well, what does that benefit him now? Everybody else kind of benefits from what he was able to do. But, and certainly you see common grace in that. Even unbelievers are able to enjoy certain aspects of their life, but there's no real fulfillment in that. There's no real joy. There's no real purpose that's brought about in life and accomplishments and tasks apart from the Lord. So he points out how that feels and the reality of the situation of the unbeliever who doesn't recognize there the Lord and what comes from that. All right, that's half the books we have to cover this afternoon. Do you want to take a break right now, or do you want to just push through? We will get done early, it seems. That's a yes to which? Let's just push through. Okay. Why don't we take like 2 minutes, 3 minutes here, short one. Sorry, Tom. I'll let Josh use it. No, sit down. Yeah.
Somebody told me he tried Buddhism or whatever, and he tried different things.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't fulfill, I don't know what he's trying to do. But because of his work, we got iPads, we got iPhones.
Yeah, that's very true. It's very true.
So we benefited. It's too bad he's there.
Yep.
In this life doesn't necessarily mean you're going to benefit
Yep.
take advantage of it.
Yep.
Because that's the whole point there. Enjoy physical life because, you're not going to enjoy it. Apart from God, you're not going to enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be just the opposite.
Yep. And I think even in this life, there's an element where if an unbeliever's honest, there's an emptiness about what he does.
Yeah, I think they just push it back and try not to think about it.
Yep. Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And you see somebody like, you think of, I don't pull these guys out for any particular reason. Steve Jobs was just the last rich, famous, powerful guy I could think of who died. But I mean, you look at these people who overdose on drugs, or they are miserable, these people who kill themselves, where you think, well, gee, I mean, there's no reason that he couldn't buy whatever he needed and wouldn't be taken care of. But you see a sadness about those things, about those people, I think, even. I think those people tend to be more in touch with the reality of their situation than most. More honest about where they're at.
Well, certainly, you got to take Solomon seriously because he's an example of achieving about everything there is
Yep.
under the sun.
Yep.
And his conclusion.
Yeah, he says, look, folks, you can't do anything that I haven't done. And that's probably still true in a lot of regards. There's nobody that, you can't be more famous, you can't accomplish more for your time than what he did. What's that?
I was going to say a really interesting sovereign way. He was the perfect person to write this book.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And there's never been anybody else who could write this.
Yep.
I mean, the only other person who could have would have been Christ. But, I mean, not in any real correlated way.
Right.
Christ wouldn't have written this. Because
Right.
he wouldn't have had that perspective.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, you just think nobody in history is qualified to write that.
Got a question. What do under the authorship there, you got 2 wise men and 3 wise men.
Boy, that harkens me back. Well, I think it's Solomon, so I'm not too worried about the 2 wise men or 3 wise.
Yeah, okay, that's just the possibility.
Right, those are the possibilities. Under those, just for you guys to use as a tool, under those selected interpretive issues, those are the general solutions to the issues that have been posited. I don't see any reason to see this as anybody other than Solomon.
It doesn't seem like there's many books that don't come under the fact that somebody discredits the
Oh, yeah. Yep.
He's the first line of that.
Yep. And some of the Old Testament books are a little less clear. You don't generally have Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, or the prophets say, the prophets are generally a little bit autobiographical, but there you go. There you go. Now you're looking sharp. All right. Yeah.
But like the Lord used Solomon to write down what he wanted.
Excuse me. Yep. Yes, that's true. That's true. The men were moved by God. All right, let's pick up Lamentations. Now, remember historically where we are when we come to Lamentations. We are at the fall of Jerusalem. Okay. By way of introduction, the Hebrew title is How. In the Talmud, it's referred to as Lamentations, and the Septuagint and the Vulgate call the book Tears. You can tell just about what it's about. It's about sadness. written in 586 BC at the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. And it is written by Jeremiah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel. This is Jeremiah's response to the fall of Jerusalem. The major themes that we see: the pain of Yahweh's servant. As you might guess, the book is called Lamentations, so it has to do with crying and tears. But we see that the city is grieved. And it's interesting, the author identifies himself with the city. We see chapter 1, verse 2, she weeps bitterly in the night, the city. Her tears are on her cheeks. She has none to comfort her. Among all her lovers, all her friends have dealt treacherously with her, and they have become her enemies. But Jeremiah very closely identifies himself with the city. We see the change there to first person in verse 12. Is it nothing to you all who pass this way? Look and see if there is any pain like my pain, which was severely dealt to me, which the Lord afflicted on the day of his fierce anger. Jeremiah associates himself very closely with the city of Jerusalem. And we see that this is recognized as being judgment from the Lord, that the coming of the Babylonians, the destruction of the city at their hand has come because God has visited judgment on them. We see that the anger of the Lord is a major theme and is brought out. But we also see that Jeremiah recognizes that not only is the Lord angry and the Lord has brought judgment on the city, but he also understands that God has been righteous in doing so. He recognizes the sinfulness of the city and the righteousness of the judgment that the Lord has brought about. And as is common with the prophets, where there is a message of judgment, there is also a reminder of the compassion of the Lord. And that's where probably our most famous verses from this book come. You can look at chapter 3, verses 22. 3:22. And back up to verse 19. Remember my affliction and my wandering, the wormwood and bitterness. Surely my soul remembers and is bowed down within me. This I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindnesses never cease, for his compassions they never fail. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Again, we see his faithfulness in verse 32. For if he causes grief, then he will have compassion, his compassion according to his abundant loving kindness, his faithful love. So judgment has come. Jeremiah recognizes the righteousness of that judgment and the righteousness of the Lord in bringing judgment and bringing pain to the city, but also recognizes that the Lord is compassionate, that he will be compassionate and preserve the people. There is a great deal made of the sin of God's people, of the Lord's people, appropriately so, because they have been very sinful, and Jeremiah again recognizes that it is the people's sin that has brought God's judgment on the people. The arrogance of the enemy is also pointed out, Babylon's arrogance in coming against the city, but also Jeremiah looks forward to the hope of restoration. We already even have looked at that a little bit in light of God's compassion on the city. The purpose of the book, the Lord's servant, Yahweh's servant, lamented Jerusalem's great destruction that was caused by her sin, and he gave a statement of repentance with a hope of restoration. So he recognizes again that the Lord has brought this judgment righteously upon the people because of their sin, and he gives a statement of repentance, turning from their sin, and has hope that the Lord will indeed restore the nation. By way of structure, you can take a look at the book of Lamentations. It's a series of 4 laments and a poem. The first lament is the destruction of Jerusalem in chapter 1. The second lament has to do with God's punishment of Jerusalem's sin in chapter 2. Chapter 3 is about the grief of Jeremiah as he observes what has happened in the city. He says, I am the man who has seen affliction because of the rod of God's wrath. The fourth lament in chapter 4 is about God's wrath as it is detailed in the siege of the city and the conditions in the city as Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians stood against the city, and it was awful in Jerusalem. And the prayer of the remnant comes in chapter 5, then a final poem, the call to remember. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our reproach. So, a call for God to remember the people. Jeremiah's response to the sinfulness of the people and the judgment that God has brought is one of repentance and one of hope. So again, very much like we saw with the prophets, but the lament of the fall of the city and the suffering that went on within the city. All right, guys, that brings us to the last book of the Old Testament. Woohoo! The book of Daniel. The book of Daniel. There we go. Title of the book is Daniel, because it's about Daniel. Very good. All right. Well done. Well done. The date of the events. There is a good deal of time that's covered here, but we span from 605 BC, which is the first of the deportations. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar comes to Jerusalem 3 different times. 605, 589, and then 586. I think it's 589. 598. I got my last 2 numbers flipped. 605, though, is the first time that he comes, and as he conquers the city of Jerusalem in 605, what he does is he takes the cream of the crop, the top of the top out of the city, the elite, the good-looking, the smart, the intelligent, the wise, the skilled people from the city. And the Babylonians like to do this. They took the cream of the crop of the people that they conquered to Babylon, and that made Babylon the greatest city in the world. It also helped keep the people that they conquered subjugated, because if you take away all of the smart, good-looking, skilled people, guess what? There was nobody left to lead any kind of rebellion or get the people to follow them in rebellion. So Daniel was apparently smart, good-looking, and skilled, or some combination thereof, because he and some of his friends were taken in that first deportation, taken to the city of Babylon. The last of the events that we have in the book of Babylon, we find in 536 BC in chapter 10, verse 1, and this puts us in the 3rd year of Cyrus the Persian. Okay, so we have 70 years worth of time really covered in the book of Daniel. 70 years worth is a pretty big chunk, pretty good chunk. The time of their deportation, the time when they're out of the land. You can take a look. Here's a chart in your set of charts and your list of charts that gives you the historical background of all of these things. When dates for these things and about how old Daniel would have been. And it's interesting, we don't have a lot about Daniel's, what would you say, prime years. We have a count of when he is 15, 17, 18, and then the next thing we jump to is 50 years old. So Daniel spends a lot of time within the political system there in Babylon. He rises to a very high level at a very young age. But then Daniel also apparently lived to be a fairly old man, probably into his 80s. But you can see there, and that'll give you an idea of how old Daniel would have been during different events and about what year we would have had with a lot of those things. Some of the major themes that we have. In the book of Daniel include, first and foremost, the sovereignty of God over the kingdoms of man. The sovereignty of God over the kingdoms of man. And we have this demonstrated in two different ways. First of all, in narrative. In chapters 2 through 6, you have a bunch of narrative, a bunch of stories. Really, chapter 1 is taken up in narrative as well. But take a look at the strong emphasis during this narrative. Daniel chapter 2, Ezekiel. Chapter 2, look at verse 28. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream and the visions in your mind while you were in your bed. Skip down to verse 47. The king answered Daniel and said, surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery. Look at chapter 3, verses 28 to 30. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent this angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command and yielding up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that my people, or that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. Take a look at chapter 4, verses 34 and 35. You'll notice that we're looking at the conclusion to each of these narratives, right? And for those of you guys who have been in hermeneutics, I think all of you were, where do you find the point of a narrative? Generally in the conclusion, right? There is an end emphasis. Chapter 4, verses 34 and 35. But at the end of the period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the hosts of the heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? Chapter 6, verses 26 and 27. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. His dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. What's the conclusion of all of those narratives? That God is God and he's in control, right? What's the one narrative we skipped over there? And by the way, whose mouth is that put in nearly 100% of the time? Nebuchadnezzar and the Gentile king, right? Daniel says it in the middle of chapter 2. But all these other times it's in the mouth of the king of the Gentiles. What's the one narrative we skipped out of Daniel in that? No, that was chapter 4. Chapter 5 is Belshazzar, the handwriting on the wall, right? Does he find out that God is the God of gods and is in control of the Gentile kingdoms? As a matter of fact, he does. How does that happen? He's dead, right? So he's not alive to have those words come out of his mouth. What's the point of the narrative of Daniel? Yahweh is the God of gods. The God of Israel is the God of gods, and he is in control of the nations and the events therein. We also see this emphasis in vision in chapters 7 through 11. We won't take the time to summarize these, but chapters 7 through 11 are almost all taken up with visions. Visions, very remarkably, of what was going to happen in the movement of time, going forward from now. By now, I mean from Daniel's now. It says this is the way that the events of the nations are going to play out. And in, I don't know if I call it mind-numbing detail, in mind-boggling detail, he lays out not only the fact that Babylon is going to be followed by Medo-Persia, is going to be followed by Alexander in Greece, is going to be followed by Rome, but how the kings, the Seleucid kings and the Ptolemaic kings who are going to come after Alexander are going to fight back and forth, and they're going to take each other by intrigue, and they're going to do this and that, and he'll give his daughter to the king of the north, and the king of the north will abandon the daughter of the king of the south, and the king of the south's daughter will no longer stand for him. And I mean, it's mind-blowing, the detail that this goes into. In fact, secular biblical historians, secular biblical historians, say that Daniel had to have been written during the Roman time period. You know why? Because there is so much detail about these nations that come after the time period of Babylon and Persia that there's no way that it could have happened beforehand. So they would place the writing, secular historians, Bible scholars, secular Bible scholars would place the writing of the book of Daniel in the Roman period, because they say this has to be somebody looking back and writing about what had happened. So not only in narrative and not only explicitly is the sovereignty of God over the kingdom of man brought to the fore, but also in vision, as you see, explanation after explanation of what was going to happen. In fact, it's interesting to me that this happens this way. When Alexander came, when he conquered, we're gonna spend next week and talk about the intertestamental period, in part because I really, really love history, but also because of what Daniel says about the intertestamental period. Zechariah has a great deal about the intertestamental period, and then as we read in our Bibles, we go straight from the nation Israel having made it back into the land and everything goes back to the way it had been, to all of a sudden we have Rome in charge and all sorts of other stuff. So I think it sets a good background for the New Testament. But I was going to say with all of this, Alexander, when he comes into Asia Minor, he goes down around the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, and when he comes to Jerusalem, the high priest and some of the Jews go out and they say, look, our scriptures testify that you're going to come and that you're going to conquer the world. And Alexander goes, oh, I like you guys, so you can do pretty much whatever you want. Just pay me taxes. And everybody gets along pretty well with Alexander in light of that. But my understanding would be that they brought him Daniel and said, look, our prophets have said that you are going to rule the world, conquer the earth. So we see that God is the one who is sovereignly in control over the kingdoms of man. I would say that gets us toward the primary theme, the primary purpose of the book of Daniel as well. But we see that Israel as a remnant is subject to the Gentiles. And one of the remarkable things that we see is Daniel is obedient to the Gentiles throughout. All right, the Jews are properly functioning as and functioning under the authority of the Gentile nations throughout the book, except when it would be sinful to do so. So as Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and their friends come into Babylon, the Babylonians want them to eat what we would call a non-kosher diet today, and they say, "Look, the God of our homeland requires that we eat a certain way," and the Babylonian in charge of what they're eating and their health allows them to do it on a trial run, to eat their diet as they would eat it. And obviously things go well for Daniel and his friends, and so they're able to do that. Daniel chapter 3 is about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar calls everyone who can hear the horn to bow down to the golden statue of himself, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego won't do it because it would be sinful to do so. Also then in chapter 6, some of the Persians fooled Darius the Mede into signing into law that if anyone prays to any god other than their gods, that they would be thrown into the lion's den. And Daniel, of course, continues to pray and is protected, kept through the lion's den as well. But by and large, Daniel and these godly Jews function under the authority and demonstrate a great deal of respect, frankly, for the Gentile rulers and the kings and the nations, and that is the expectation for them. We see also the progression of the Gentile kingdoms several times in different visions. We see how the kingdoms of the Gentiles would progress, and we see on a fairly regular basis the pride of the Gentile kings. Nebuchadnezzar, chapters 2, 3, and 4. We see Belshazzar's pride in chapter 5. We also see, by the way, Nebuchadnezzar's humbling in chapter 4. Seems to me you have his testimony of salvation, becoming a worshiper of the God of Israel in chapter 4. Belshazzar in chapter 5. The little horns, both in chapters 7 and 8, and they boast of great boasts, pictures of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Antichrist. And all of this looks forward to the ultimate establishment of the kingdom of God. Remember, both statues and beasts are ultimately upset and overturned by the coming of the kingdom that comes without earthly foundations, but rather heavenly ones. The purpose of the book of Daniel is to demonstrate the sweep of human history during Gentile domination until the establishment of God's kingdom upon the earth. The reality for the Jews at this point is that they are now functioning in a time of Gentile domination. And to be honest, that Gentile domination is going to continue until Jesus Christ returns and sets up the millennial kingdom. And Daniel prepares the Jews to live. Daniel prepares the Jews to live in light of this reality. That's what the book of Daniel is set out for. By way of the structure, you can look at Daniel And there are a number of different charts that you can look through there to look at different sections of the book. There are a couple of different ways that people have gone about breaking down the book of Daniel. Some see a break between chapters 6 and 7 because there's a transition there from narrative-driven events to visions and dreams that Daniel has. But there's a structure that's not easy for us to see in English. A pretty dramatic structural change that happens. Chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 3 are written in Hebrew. And then chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic. And then chapters 8 to the end, to chapter 12, are written again in Hebrew. And I think this gives us the best indication of how we ought to break down the book. Aramaic would have been the language spoken at large, the lingua franca. It would have been what the Gentile nations would have spoken. And Hebrew would have been obviously what the Jews spoke. The Jews probably at this point, most of them understand Aramaic, able to speak it. But I think you have an indication in chapter 1. You have the godly remnant of Israel talking to Jews primarily about Jews. In chapters 2 through 7, you have the prophetic course of Gentile dominion. That is written in Aramaic. I think there's a larger audience here than just the Jews. All right, I think God's intention is for the Gentiles to be able to understand the message of the book of Daniel, particularly the middle section, as well as the Jews. He wants the Gentile nations to understand why he has granted them control for a time. And then chapters 8 through 12 focus particularly on the prophetic course of Israel during Gentile dominion. So the scope of address widens out in chapters 4 through 8 or 4 through 7. That's written in Aramaic so a larger group could understand it. The focus is also broader. Remember, the first of the narration, the first of the narrative there would have been the dream of Nebuchadnezzar of the statue, right? You're not necessarily focused on the nation Israel in particular. You're focused there on the scope of events in world history. What ends that section? Daniel's vision of the beasts, right? And the nations that were going to come within the sweep of things, within the sweep of history. You have in chapter 3 the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Chapter 4 is the humiliation and probably, I think, salvation again of Nebuchadnezzar and his statement regarding Yahweh, the God of Israel. You have in chapter 5 the fall of Babylon and the arrogance of Belshazzar. Chapter 6, Daniel in the lion's den. God in control of what's going on there as well. Chapter 7, then the visions begin. Then starting in chapter 8, you have a honing in again on what's Israel's plight going to be like during this period of time. What is it going to be like for the nation Israel? So I think following the structure of the language there is a good way to understand what's going on in the book of Daniel. And you can see again how some of the different sections of the book break down in some of those other charts. In your book of charts, so that covers the Old Testament, guys. I'm sure you've got it all now. No questions about the Old Testament whatsoever? No. That should give you a pretty good overview, though, and a pretty good idea of what's there and what the themes are and what each book is about. But like I've pointed to, like I've alluded to, this is a start for you guys so that you can begin to do study on your own and have a good, solid foundation of what everything else is about.